Hi, I'm Dr. Gwen, and my channel is all about empowering the neurodiverse community. In this episode, Elizabeth Hamblet comes onto the show to talk about her book, The 7 Steps to College Success, a pathway for students with disabilities. We discuss the importance of starting college preparation early, some academic and non-academic skills that students need, and a better way to think about accommodations and services at the collegiate level. If you are a student who is preparing to go to college or an adult who's in the position to help a student make the transition, this episode may be for you. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am so excited to welcome Elizabeth Hamblet, the author of 7 Steps to College Success, a pathway for students with disabilities. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you?
Hi, and so excited to be here. I'm a fan of yours, so it's very exciting to get
Oh,
to
that
myself.
that's so nice. That's so nice. Hey, Elizabeth, before we get started into the book, maybe what you can do is help the audience know who you are.
Sure. So I work part-time in a college's disability services office. So 2 days a week, I work one-on-one with students who are registered with that university's office, and I work on time management, as you can imagine, for college students, and organization, reading and writing strategies, prioritizing all the kinds of things that are really challenging at college. And then the rest of the time, and also in life, I suppose. Um, we don't often write papers after college, so that does my life easier. And then the rest of the time, I am writing and presenting on preparing students with disabilities for successful college transition. I run a Facebook group focused on this, and just try to keep getting out and letting people know the stuff I know.
Yeah, and it's so important. And as I was settling into your book, it's so clear and it's so comprehensive.
Oh,
And I
thank you.
think and I think what parents don't know and students don't know is that if they've been supported by an IEP, yay, you had this probably and hopefully wonderful team surrounding the student, but the team of adults were the one really driving the accommodations and the modifications and the services, hopefully including the student along the way. But it was really the adults that were responsible. And now we move from IDEA to ADA when we've left high school, and all the burden of responsibility falls onto the student under a different set of legal structure. And I'm not sure that parents and students are fully aware of what that shift is like. And I do feel like your book really does say it very clearly, not to make people anxious by any means, but to empower people with
That's
information, even though I know it can be anxiety provoking.
And I do too. And so, the sooner families know about this stuff, the better, because it's all about the planning and setting the goals and objectives. And, when there's time at the start of, high school to help students develop skills, I think that is, time we need to take full advantage of and get them as ready as we possibly can. I mean, is every student who goes to college in the general population fully ready for college? Probably not. I think there's a lot of adjustment everybody makes to that. But as you say, when there's been a lot of supports provided, it's really important to understand those differences. And in my opinion, to start early, because there is time, and we want to build and you talk about this so much in your work, their competence, their confidence. The more experience they have managing things on their own, the more they're going to know that they can do this stuff. And that will cut that anxiety going into college.
Yeah, yes, and skills, right? Like skills and experience are truly what remove doubt. And or in a different way we can say that is, that skills. I really feel like skills and your knowledge that you can rely on yourself with those skills really can be the antidote to anxiety, which is there for a reason. We're anxious about things that mean a lot to us, that we
Yeah.
care deeply about, and so. But, anxiety can be paralyzing. And, I think your book really helps families and students know, hey, like, this is what you can expect, right? This is how college is different than high school, so that you can prepare. You said, Elizabeth, start as early as you can. When do you think it's a good time for students to start preparing for college life, if that's where they're thinking they're going to go?
Yeah, so this is something I find myself thinking a lot. In a lot of communities, not all of them, there is a lot of pressure around college, and we are making students in general very anxious about it from a very young age. So, as I say these things, I kind of kick myself because I hate to be part of that. But here's what's important. When you are writing the eighth grade, in eighth grade, when you're writing the IEP or the 504 plan for for high school. I think if the student has an interest in college, and I hate to ask a 14-year-old that, but a lot of them at least are considering it, then there needs to be discussion about what happens the following year. So, first of all, just as far as their opportunities at the end of that go, I get approached sometimes by families where the school is offering to waive its own graduation requirements, the high school, I should say. So maybe the student with dyslexia doesn't have to take foreign language, or maybe the student with dyscalculia doesn't have to take certain levels of math. Well, that is something the high school can do and make a decision about. But they should know that if the student wants to go to X university and that university requires those classes, they are not required to make exceptions to their admissions requirements for that student because they didn't take it because of their disability. And so when we talk about empowering students, whether it's sometimes the school recommends it, sometimes the family is asking for it, but nobody should be making that decision without explaining, to the student the ramifications of that down the road. And so that's really important. If you have a student going into high school who is receiving what we call modifications at the college level, which the laws themselves, so Section 504, Subpart E, and the ADA cover colleges. And so it's really important to be clear to your audience. You sort of alluded to this. IDEA does not apply at the college level. And so while the wording in IDEA does not say this, what it essentially means is once your student either graduates from high school or ages out of the system, they no longer have an IEP for any legal purposes. That document doesn't hold any water, so to speak. And colleges are not required to provide accommodations and services just simply because they were written into a student's last high school IEP. Now, 504 is the subject of a lot of confusion, understandably, because you look at it and you say, well, Elizabeth, I see 504 is at the college level, so what are we talking about? It's a different subpart. And so, in the same way, even though the wording does not say this in subpart D or E, colleges don't have to follow 504 plans. If they happen to see the accommodations as being reasonable and appropriate for that student, they may grant the same ones, which is what leads some families with students who had high school IEPs to say, the college is following my kid's 504 plan. No, they're not. They are just providing the accommodations they think are appropriate for that student and that are appropriate at the college level. Which brings me back, I promise to get back to it, to that ninth grade start that we were talking about. If a student is starting ninth grade with what we call modifications, so things like they don't have to write a paper, they can do a project instead. Or every time a paper is due, they can write a shorter paper. They don't have to read, are we still reading Charles Dickens? Great Expectations. They get to read something else, or they can watch the movie. Those are what colleges consider modifications because they change the expectations for what students are going to do. They're not changing the way the information is delivered, which is how we often would describe accommodations. It's what they do at the end. If that's what they're getting in freshman year of high school, then we need to talk about what skills they would need to develop so that by the end of high school, they are doing the same assignments, taking the same assessments as their classmates, because they won't get modifications at college.
Yep. Yep.
So that's why it's so important. And I don't love talking about it that early, but you've got 4 years and somebody needs to be thinking about. So maybe freshman year you do have all of those accommodations and supports, modifications, a lot of support from adults where you know teachers have to email you the assignments. That stuff's not happening at college. So what skills do we need to learn over 4 years that we don't need that anymore? And student can perform that function.
Yeah, and this is, this brings up for me like even the role of a one-on-one aide, right? So
Yeah.
when I see, 40 accommodations, let's just say
Hmm.
on an IEP, and I'm looking at a senior with
Hmm.
40 accommodations and they're all being
Hmm.
used, plus a
Hmm.
one-on-one aide, and we're looking at four-year college, I say,
Yeah.
okay, let's have this conversation about what college looks like. What
Hmm.
is available? What's the
Hmm.
difference between an accommodation and a service? Those two things are now
Also
different,
important. Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
At that level. But and then the instinct or the inclination is, okay, well, let's just fade this one-on-one based on time. And I'll say, no,
Hmm.
no, no, you don't fade one-on-ones based on time. You fade one-on-one based on what service or support they're providing. So for example,
Um,
if they're saying, hey, I'm writing down all the students' assignments in their planner, I would be like, well, if they can do it on their own, we're going to fade that specific support because now the student
right.
can do it on their own. Not that we go from full day to 3/4 day to half day to quarter day to, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And I
that
think
makes so
that,
much sense. Yes.
right. So it's like we need to look at like the function that the aid is providing or the function
Hmm.
that accommodation is providing, see if we can't replace it with a skill. And then we know. But and inevitably, like, our students need longer runways. They need that longer runway
Yeah.
to really get the skills under their belt. And so we do, I love that you're saying, and I'm in total agreement. We need to start this in freshman year, like at
Hmm.
latest. Like at the latest, we really need to be thinking about this, even if the decision to go to college changes. Like that's okay,
Right. Right. I
right?
mean, how many of us have changed our plans in a lifetime? I'm going to be 55 this year, and I've had a lot of plans that went in different
Right.
directions. So,
Yeah, and it's okay, but be specific. I mean, I think that's another thing that I see. We're not specific
hmm.
enough in high school.
Hmm.
So we're just saying, oh, we'll go to college after high school. And it's like,
Yeah.
but there's so
Yeah.
many different types of
Right.
post-secondary placements that,
Right.
right? So I love that you're like, let's start early, let's build skills. Um, you brought up academic supports, and that I find, Elizabeth, and you're the expert on this because you're at that in that collegiate setting. I find that the accommodations that are allowed,
Hmm.
approved at the collegiate level are way, way, way fewer than the accommodations in under IDEA or at that high school level. Am I
Well,
off
and
on that?
it depends. Well, I only hesitated because I think what I don't know too, because my focus is learning how many accommodations are being made, in residence halls, dining services, recreational facilities on campus. So all of that falls under accommodation. And so, whatever kind of disability a student has, they should be aware that there are accommodations. Unfortunately, I have come across people in over the years that have, a friend once emailed me because some college consultants online had put up a post saying that accommodations were only for students with physical disabilities at college, and they were 100% wrong. So I want to be clear that whatever kind of disability it is, there are accommodations. It's not always the accommodation students are seeking, to be honest. One thing that I keep very active in my community online, single rooms for all varieties of disabilities, just there's not enough housing supply at most colleges to provide a single to every student who requests it. And it's not to say that the requests aren't legitimate, but they basically have to pick and choose based on their impression of the strongest need for that. Uh, so there are numbers, dozens of accommodations available. different ones for different kinds of disabilities, although we don't tend to, because I've seen people ask this, we don't tend to say, Gwen, you have ADHD, you get what's in this column. And if you have dyslexia, you get in this column. It's tied to whatever we see as the functional limitation that the student
Mm-hmm.
experiences that sort of defines their disability. So certainly there are things you referred to services, and I think that's actually a better way to talk about it. So professors emailing students the assignments, which might have been done by high school teachers, not really an accommodation. We would probably let think that falls under services. We don't have to do certain things. And to be clear, the law says we don't have to do anything that qualifies, if you would, or it can be defined as a personal service. So in the wording of 504 itself, it refers specifically to readers for personal study. So that is a very specific example that it provides. But like if you're taking a test with us and you have a reading disability, we might provide you with a human reader, or we might provide you with a laptop equipped with software that will read the test aloud to you. A lot of my colleagues prefer to use technology over humans for a variety of reasons: convenience, cost, but also because it promotes students' independence. And so that kind of thing we would do. But when you need to read your history assignments for tomorrow, we do not send a human being to your dorm at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're sitting down to do your work, to be a young person again. So,
Yeah.
that kind of service is not something we have to provide. When it comes to things like even, my service is a learning disability specialist. My college does not have to provide to my students. We don't have to provide any kind of specialized tutoring where I work. Just happens to do that and without a fee. So one-on-one aids are things that colleges don't provide. They might approve it for a student who needs it, but the student would have to find that aid and, if needed, pay them. And sometimes colleges have agreements that the aides sign about what they will and won't do.
Mm-hmm.
So to very badly answer your question, I think that there are a lot of things that high schools, as you I think were alluding to, do for students that we don't, and the modifications that they provide that we don't. So if
Yeah.
that, I think individual students might have the experience of having fewer accommodations, perhaps based on what they were receiving in high school. But as an office itself, we offer lots.
Yeah. And maybe for those of you out there that are, thinking about making this launching into college, and you've got a full list of accommodations and modifications that you use in high school, it is probably would be helpful for you to say to yourself, okay, do I use all these?
Hmm.
Right? And are these available at the collegiate level?
Hmm.
And if not, what am I going to do about that? What
Right, right, which
what
is
am
a
I
lot
going to
for a
do?
teenager, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, obviously, like I keep going, and I can't help myself because I'm a psychologist, but I keep going back to this idea of really knowing oneself, having good self
Mhm.
knowledge, right? That's not only
Yeah.
good for advocacy and determination, self
Mhm.
determination, but it's also good for like management and all the other kind of non academic skills. Your book, and I was telling you off the air that your lesson or your step number 3 really resonated with me because it was all like the non-academic skills. It was about self-determination and executive functioning and self-management that always resonate with me. But that those are college readiness skills as well.
Yeah,
um
sure.
you
And even
know
for students who don't have disabilities, that's
oh
what my
yeah.
interest is. But I think there's so
Yeah.
much carryover. And often when I give a presentation, people will say to me, well, this applies to the general population, to which I can only nod my head and say, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
You need to know that you are bad at resisting temptation. And so when you leave the dining hall, don't go back to your dorm, go to the library, because you're going to find it hard not to end up socializing. That these are things that you need to know about yourself, regardless of whether you have a disability or not. So um, I think parents are sometimes surprised, and probably so are the students. You hear these tales. This is apocryphal, but I've heard them about, so and so is a valedictorian of their class, and they went off and they ended up, dropping out of college, because college is certainly primarily an academic environment, right? That's what we're going to do. We're going to take classes and learn stuff. But in a lot of cases, we're living there and we are eating
Yeah.
there and we are socializing and participating in activities. And so all of those pieces, when families, say to a student, essentially, you just focus on your academics, and you don't have to do chores and you don't have to have any other responsibilities. It's not setting them up particularly well to go off to college and do things. And when they're constantly, intervening with teachers and administrators. And look, there are some situations where students are treated unfairly, but there are also situations where we need to teach students the language of how to do things. And even just, we model the way we send an email, we model the way we call somebody, or, communicate. And so we can model it. We can then serve as a guide to students to do this on their own, and then sort of step back and let them do these things. But what's so important for me, and you alluded to this, self-efficacy, this concept that, yeah, if you have had these experiences and you feel confident, you will do the things you need to do. And they can't build self-efficacy if they have no experiences.
Yeah, I mean, self-efficacy is built on the truth of actions. I
Hmm.
mean, we know inevitably when we've done something for ourselves,
Right.
versus someone telling us that we have, and how
Hmm.
important that is. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about chores,
Yeah.
actually, and that, even starting, for little kids, doing age appropriate, developmentally appropriate
Hmm.
chores, is an important part of autonomy and agency,
Yeah.
because being able to take care of yourself and where you live, is an important piece. And the jump to college or the jump away from home is big enough as it is. And, we know psychologically that it's one of the most vulnerable times for a young
Yeah.
person is
Sure.
this transition. And so how do we prepare, not hope for the best, right? And I think that's the
That's
difference,
right.
right?
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
your book is so thorough. I mean, I think if anyone wants a real understanding of the process of that, of going to college and preparing for college, like you cover the law and
Hmm.
rights and procedures. Like that's important to understand, because that's what's framing what you're getting, or what a college or a university is responsible for, which is
Right.
different than what you experienced, in high school, all the way to both academic and non-academic skills, that are necessary to, contacting disability services, to using your accommodations, to using the help, which is its own skill, right? Like you got to use the help that's also offered.
Right. I mean, and I hear this. I just last week spoke with an MD, who wrote a great book about taking care of your health as a college student,
Oh
and
yeah.
she talked a lot about. I mean, and it was surprising to me to see in a book which also includes, like, what happens if you get strep throat, and how to know whether you should take that broken toe in to be looked at. She talked about academic struggles and the importance of getting, anticipating them and getting ahead of things and not waiting until, the last minute to go seek help. And those are skills. I think when students are accustomed to always sitting down with an adult anytime they have work to do and having somebody say, okay, now what are we going to do first? Or here's what we're going to do first. Take this out, and walking them through. There's value to that for students who really aren't ready to do that yet. But again, as the progression goes through high school, that should turn into a student sitting down and saying to an adult, here's what I need to do. And not always having somebody there at the ready, because
Yep.
you need to try some things and figure out what's really not working before you go in and you can articulate what you need help with. If you just walk into a
Yeah.
professor's office and say, I just don't get it. Well, what don't you get?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and I was that student in philosophy class, to be honest, but
Yeah.
it, and also to deal with a little bit of frustration
Yep.
before, that tolerance is so important. Life is
Yeah.
frustrating in so many ways, and experiences in college can be frustrating. And so,
Yeah.
again, going back to not just having the ability to get an A on a paper, but the ability to, self regulate. Um,
Yeah.
it's important.
It's so important. I mean, I think, oftentimes in executive functioning, we forget that frustration tolerance or distress tolerance is a
Mhm.
part of executive functioning because
Mhm, mhm.
inevitably, we need to be able to tolerate frustration and distress in order to achieve those goals that are a little bit outside of our reach, which college
Right.
is so about that. I mean, it's like, I remember back in college and even grad school, it's like, just pass stats, just pass, just one class at a time, just one class at a time, just one class, or
Yeah.
whatever that was, and however I got through. But how do you work? How do you keep yourself healthy? How do you find your balance?
Mhm.
How do you not get behind? Procrastination is I think I in my practice I talk a lot about energy management versus time management because so many of my clients are dealing with their energy.
Sure.
And it's like, when are you so that you don't get behind? Because when you do get behind, that's when things start to really unravel, right?
Mhm,
When
mhm.
now I'm playing catch up, I'm not producing the best work I can. Then that's like downward spiral. I don't feel good about being a student. I'm now
Yeah.
becoming overwhelmed. My mental health is
Sure.
going down the like it is something, and I do think that in preparation for college, I really wish that more schools would do more of this curriculum, right? This
Mm,
self-knowledge curriculum, this executive
mhm.
functioning curriculum. I like how to take notes for your learning
Yeah.
style even. You
Right.
know,
Right.
um yeah.
Keep going. I'm gonna pull out my favorite thing. So sorry, I should have had this ready for you, but
No, that's
whoop,
okay.
let me do this. Outsmart Your
Oh,
Brain came out this
yeah.
spring. And this, I can't stop talking about how wonderful this
Okay, I
book
got to
is.
put it down.
Yes, it teaches students how to be students. And he suggests, so Daniel Willingham is a cognitive scientist. By the way, you can find him on social media. He does great TikToks for college students.
That's awesome.
And he looks at the research and then talks about what we know about the brain, and he's very practical about note taking, which is a complicated skill. And that's sort of where the if we're going to go back to high school and what's happening there. So sometimes in high school, teachers have to give students copies of their notes. That is not, I mean, I occasionally hear from a parent who says that's happening for their student, but not all professors have notes. And if they don't, we are not in a position to make them create those notes. Or if they do, they might be understandable only to the professor. And we don't have to make them comprehensible. So how do we accommodate students? A lot more of my colleagues are moving to technology rather than human
Mhm.
note takers. Again,
Mhm.
a lot of reasons human note takers are a huge headache. And one of the challenges is, and Dr. Willingham refers to this in his book, is that if I if I go to said stats class, um, I don't really know anything about stats. So let's say my note taker is a student who's a good stats student, and that note taker is probably not going to take that many notes because they already know a bunch of stuff. And I get my notes and I think, well, wait a minute, what about all this stuff? The purpose of note taking accommodations as a category is considered by many of my colleagues to be a way to help students catch what they missed, not to
Mm.
um, reinterpret what was said in class for students.
Mm.
And so sometimes that's what they're looking for, is somebody to say, well, this is what was important. And so going back to what we do in high school, I know that one of my colleagues has said she's been to school districts where students are given sets of guided notes by all the teachers. So again,
Wow.
that is not, it's a useful exercise for a time, in that they start to hopefully glean that these are the kinds of things you pay attention to. But those are not things that colleges often do. And sometimes, so this note taking software records the lecture. Your student is usually typing away also at the same time. And then it links like the words in the document with the sound. So that if my ADHD kicked in and I started thinking about the pizza I'm going to have tonight, and sort of lost the thread, when I go back to my dorm room, I can navigate back to that part of the lecture and say, "Oh, this is what he said about base rates," um, and take my notes, pause it, and listen, and do that stuff. Now, again, there are more than, but not again. I haven't said this yet. There are more than 4,000 colleges in the country. I would not presume to know what happens at all of them. I've seen no stats on, for instance, how many schools provide human note takers versus technology. But this is all part of that preparation and that awareness. If people,
Yeah.
if adults are doing things for students at the high school level, we need to figure out what resources are available to teach them some of those skills and get them practicing.
Yeah, completely agreed. How do we replace that human being with like a tool
Hmm.
or a skill that the student can use on their own? And
Right.
of course, if we've tried, right, and it's not, we can't replace it, that is also informative. Like,
Uh, exactly.
right?
Exactly.
But we
Right.
got to try. Like we
Right.
have to try to do these things. And I think sometimes this idea of going to college is as simple as the progression. And the reason why I observe that some families are very attached to the idea of college is because this is what everyone does after they graduate high school, right?
Quote
As
unquote,
simple as,
everyone.
right, exactly. I go from ninth grade to 10th grade to 11th grade to 12th grade to college. And it's
Hmm.
like, oh, wait a minute. Like, actually, there's so many options
Right.
coming out of graduation or after after you've kind of aged out of district support, let's say. There's so many options, and what is then necessary to understand is what are the strengths and the interests and the needs and
Hmm.
preferences of your student.
Hmm.
That really is what should be directing some of those decisions. But I
Yeah.
think we get caught with this attachment to going to college, and then they get there and then they're very unprepared, and it's so full of suffering that
Yeah. I mean,
that's I see.
I think, part of it is, as you say, for a lot of communities, it's just the expectation that we will do this. And I think, look, again, they're neurotypical peers. Some of them don't know why they're there. They just did what they were
Yeah.
expected to do. And, maybe they're not having a good time. But when writing a paper in high school is a torment, and when reading an assigned book is a torment, and the student is being dragged through or dragging themselves, you do have to stop and take a moment and say, "So you want 4 more years of this with less support?"
And higher,
And
and with a higher level, with
yeah,
more
yeah, oh yeah,
expectations.
right. So I can understand any 18-year-old saying, "I really don't know what I want to do."
Yeah.
So I just saw a brief piece in the Chronicle of Higher Ed saying that more students, certainly since COVID, are putting off the start of college. And so I think that can be, if you have a student who's just, every academic exercise is a torment, what are we talking about here? And so maybe after a year of not going to school and working someplace,
Mhm.
they may decide that, all right, it was tough, but it's something I'm willing to do. Because if it's not what they're willing to do and they have to self motivate the whole time, how do you make yourself do things that are unpleasant? If you are not doing that, in high school, it gets harder at college because there's so many distractions
Yeah.
and nobody
Oh, yeah.
supervising you.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed. Oh my gosh. So agreed. I highly to my audience out there. I mean, if you're really thinking about college seriously, right? Whether you're a student or you're a family member, or let's say you're even like a college counselor in high school, or a college consultant, like I honestly, they need to read your book, Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you. I
They
hope they will.
really, they really do, because I really believe it's just brass tacks. Like it gets down really clearly how the landscape changes and what some of these readiness skills are, what the necessary readiness skills are, at minimum for this. And again, not to make people anxious, because that's not what you and I are about. It is about empowerment through information.
Yeah, yeah. And I had a comment under one of my appearances, and a parent said, "Well, she's Elizabeth. High school was already hard as a parent. Like high school was hard enough, and we know it's going to be hard at college. And could you maybe not just be such a Debbie Downer?" And that's not my intention. And you know, it stayed with me. I want to be clear that their students are going to colleges. They are going to all range of colleges. They are going to art schools. They're going to engineering schools. They are going to highly selective, or as some folks in the field call them, highly rejective colleges, and they
Mm-hmm.
are thriving. And I have worked over 20 years now with some really bright and interesting and motivated students who have figured out for themselves, what they need. Did they all start that way? No, but many of them get there. But it's about their willingness to utilize the supports available to them. And, look, everybody's making a transition to college, and a lot of students are going to figure it out. And some of the, um, smart people in the education and the counseling field also talk about, like my friend Ned Johnson, who co-wrote The Self-Driven Child. It's also partially about what response are they going to get if they say, yeah, I got a C. So part of it is, as parents, we need to be prepared for the idea that transition, may have some bumps and bruises along the way,
Yeah.
and normalize that for students too. Right? So
Yeah.
some of them, it is like, not to say it's hard and you need to be scared, but it's going to be a challenge. You'll figure it out. Seek out the help that's available to you, and it's okay with us if it's not straight A's, which we are used to, or we've never done before, but somehow we expect you to do at college. That you're there to, but that you're there to grow and to learn, and if you're not taking care of yourself, if you're not taking care of your responsibilities, that's a different conversation. But no, it can be very exciting. Some students find they get to pursue their passions, right? You choose a
Yeah.
major and you study stuff that really interests you. They like reinventing themselves after 4 years of being whoever they decided everybody thought they were in high school. It's an opportunity for that. Now, sometimes they decide to reinvent themselves without ever associating themselves with our office. And so that's also their choice. So those students are getting through school, we assume, but we don't know anything about them.
Yeah, and you bring up there's wow, there's so many little alleys and avenues we could go down. And part of this is, and this is why I love like Carol Dweck's work, right? This idea
Hmm.
of like like kind of having a growth mindset to this, which is let's focus on effort and
Yeah.
engagement,
Yeah.
not kind of outcome product.
Hmm.
And that, as parents, we have a huge role in the way in which our kids see themselves.
Hmm.
Whether, through our own actions, through our own inability or ability to manage our own distress that comes up when we raise children and we raise young people who are about to leave our homes. It has a lot to do with, as a parent, how do we manage our own distress surrounding that? Because the way we manage our own distress can unintentionally oppress or suppress our children's autonomy and agency. So
Uh-huh.
so much of this, it's complicated. And so really empowering yourself through information and knowledge of not only what the expectations are, but of yourself and your kid can, I think, help you find that bespoke, tailored, individualized way of really making an informed choice
Mm-hmm.
about college, what kind of college. I mean, your book also highlights this. It's not just about going to college. It's like, what kind of college? Big college,
Right.
little college? What's a class size? How do you learn that? There's colleges to meet all of those needs in regards to how big a campus is, how small a campus is, what the class sizes are. There are where it's located, temperature, environment. I mean, those are all things
Right.
to consider, you know.
And they're really important. And so people are surprised. Somebody just emailed me, and I just did a talk last week with somebody who said she was surprised that I did not recommend, um, when students are looking at colleges, starting with the Disability Services Office. And she said, well, I was shocked by that. And I said, well, it's not just me who thinks so. It's my colleagues in Disability
Mhm.
Services offices. Because if you send a student, for instance, to, Landmark College in Vermont or Beacon College in Florida, which are the two schools in the country solely for students with learning disabilities, ADHD, and autism. If they don't like the heat down in Florida, if they don't like, snow up in Vermont, like that is enough to make you miserable where you are.
Yep.
If they don't have the major that thrills you,
Yeah.
that is not going to work. And so, there are 4,000 colleges. They're not all 4-year schools, but you know, you may have to work a little harder to find the place that has all of the things that you are looking for. But an unhappy student isn't going to, having the accommodations you think are important to their success will not make them be successful
Mhm.
in and of itself. And in fact, when you get to the gosh, it's my own work. I think it's the appendix. It might be chapter 7, where I think it's chapter 7, which is focused on accommodations that are and aren't commonly approved and why. Um, it talks about, I reviewed the research that's available, and the leaders in my own field, really can't draw a conclusion about, does having extended time and a note taker really make a student successful at college? There's so many factors that go into all of this stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't think, very unhappy students in a place that doesn't suit them probably thrive.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. That's a great place. That's a great place to just kind of summarize things, right? Like you got to feel good to do good. Like,
Hmm.
so that's so great. Hey, Elizabeth, if someone is listening to this interview and they're like, I got to get Elizabeth's book, or I got to know where Elizabeth is and what she's doing. What are the best ways to find you and your work?
So it's hard to miss me on social media. Sometimes I'm under my name, sometimes it's under my business, which is LD, as in Learning Disabilities Advisory. So my website is ldadvisory.com. And from there, you can get links to my socials. So on my website, there are loads of free blog posts you can access with advice. It's a lot of bonus content, from the interviews I did for my book. So you can see advice from disability services offices for parents, for educators, for students, um, all sorts of things there. I have a YouTube channel. I interview folks like you too that I think are a lot to say to help families. So there are interviews there. My book, if you go to the site, there's a page for it, but it's available everywhere. Barnes and Noble, not always on the shelf, but through them. Amazon. If you go to my website, to the book page, there's 20% off if you order directly from my publisher. And I always hope you'll order from an independent bookstore.
Awesome. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being in the space, for being a wonderful contributor to the space, and for just sharing your time and talents today on the show. I appreciate
Well,
it.
thank you for having me. It's always a lovely opportunity to talk to some more folks and get the word out.